Anyways,
Yeah.
are we recording?
Yeah, we are recording.
Oh.
You can see the waveform moving.
Okay,
So
it
that's
doesn't
how
really.
we know we're
Yeah,
we're
but we
engaged.
can.
I got my mojo working. Geoffrey Clarfield to my left, or at 4 o'clock, and I'm Ken Ramm here at 2 o'clock. I got my mojo working. The discovery of the blues, or how two white kids from the Beaverland learned about a very special kind of music. Really, you can divide this whole saga up into a number of different parts that we're going to touch on, hopefully over a number of different episodes. When you first heard the blues, some of the first white interpreters that brought the blues music over, the blues missionaries like the Rolling Stones, the Americans who were the missionaries like Paul Butterfield, the acoustic blues, people like Reverend Gary Davis, the electric blues that follows from that as you take the path up the Mississippi River, my slide guitar playing, and my influences like Pink Floyd, and Geoff's influences that came into his life, ethnomusicology background, and the tradition of the griot, the storyteller, which is really a big thing in all songs and song forms and blues music, and my influences of doing 21st century blues, mixing electronica into Euphoria. All of those different things are different stories, and all of it culminating in some of the theories that a great musicologist like Alan Lomax had that really led all of that into what our story is here. I Got My Mojo Working, a discovery of the blues. So, Geoff, when do you think you first heard the blues?
Well, I heard the blues or something like it, because if we avoid a technical discussion about what actually comprises blues, we're talking about blues-like things, what ethnomusicologists call African retentions, aspects of West African music that maintained its continuity in the southern United States among African Americans. So it was probably 1957. I was in nursery school. We had a dance music session, and the teachers played us the Hokey Pokey. It tickled my fancy in a way that's almost Freudian. Let's not go into the details there, but I'm sure you can understand what I'm talking about. And the melody struck me, and the rhythm struck me, and it captured me. I imagine that we all came to the blues, which is what this is about, in different ways. So I'd be very interested in when you have a clear memory of something blues or blues-like that captured your soul.
I always remember my mom taking me to see In the Heat of the Night, directed by Norman Jewison, and of course with Sidney Poitier in the lead, and Rod Steiger as the sheriff. And that, of course, with Ray Charles doing the theme song, really, for some reason, that resonates with me.
Well, it's funny because if you compare and contrast your and my experience, our first exposure to the blues was something passionate. For me, it was the interpersonal lascivious of it. For you, it was the South. Strangely enough, I would say it was a kind of introduction to the tragic, which, if you look at our upbringings in post-World War II Toronto and in Canada, there was no room for the tragic. It was all supposed to be blue skies and sunny days and upward mobility and professions. And when you look back even at the school curriculum, with the exception of a few Shakespearean plays when we were 15 or 16, there was no room for angst. And I would posit that perhaps at a very deep level, we were attracted in a normal way because the tragic is very much part of life.
It sounds like a very good analogy, and certainly an exposure to the tragic is definitely what I was talking about in
Absolutely.
my example, for sure. Let's talk about the transition into a person from a white culture who was, of course, a big influence on music and that kind of music, and that's going to be Elvis Presley and his songs like Hound Dog and Heartbreak Hotel, and all the other songs that Elvis was involved with, That's All Right Mama, any of these songs like that he brought to the white world. I unfortunately came into Elvis I probably did subliminally hear these songs, but I came into Elvis a little bit more in a period that I'm not personally greatly enamored with, post-Army period. And
The unmaking of Elvis Presley, as Guralnick, his author, calls that period.
yeah,
Whereas the blues part was the making of Elvis Presley, which is the subtitle for his Last Train to Memphis bio of Elvis till he was about 22, that point you just point out.
yeah, I mean, that's a whole other discussion, that
Right.
that thing of management abuse potentially, that would
100%.
be, and record companies and management and other things that we can talk
And the
about.
pushback against the blues, because Elvis had spent a lot of time listening to blues, collecting it. There's even a picture in the early book of him with B.B. King. And this is all before he went to the Army. So Elvis had a real ear for the blues. At the time that I heard him, I was 5, 6, 7 years old. None of us knew what the blues was, but God, he was playing it everywhere. So something like Heartbreak Hotel, which was on Elvis Presley, that's probably when I first saw it, sitting there with my older sister who was an Elvis fan. I don't know, was it 59 or 60? So I would have been 7 years old. And I saw him perform Heartbreak Hotel, which is a classic blues number, and he does it in a very bluesy way. That was the next stage for me psychologically. And listening to Hound Dog and Jailhouse Rock, the foreignness of it was expressed by the fact that I couldn't understand how the snare drum worked. I don't think I had seen a snare drum in action in a band like that. I imagined those rim shots, which you hear on some of his recordings. Some of his recordings were just a trio, there were no drums, but the ones that had drums, it was out of my soundscape. So we had a stainless steel garbage can in my parents' kitchen, which had a pedal and pushed up the lid. And when it came down, it sounded like that rim shot. So when I first heard Heartbreak Hotel and Hound Dog and these other very bluesy pieces that Elvis was breaking with, I didn't think that he had a stainless steel garbage can behind him, but that was the only thing I could connect to the sound, suggesting that it really was something foreign and marvelous that was coming into my world.
It's interesting just to talk a little bit more about the Elvis situation. Well, he exposed a certain part of that, and then the ascent of certain artists like Chuck Berry and Little Richard, and even a closely related musical kin like Jerry Lee Lewis,
Right.
to Elvis, the whole Sun
Right.
crowd, and even, of course, Buddy Holly. They all rose to ascension at around a certain time. And then with Elvis going into the Army, Chuck Berry having potential legal complications, Little Richard having his certain situations, Buddy Holly unfortunately dying in a tragic plane accident, all collided at the same time too. And once again, pop culture showcased a little bit of its building people up and tearing them down kind of thing that we see in later pop culture eventually with other figures.
You raise a really excellent point, talking about the crossover of any Americana performer from his or her artistic source and colliding with the commercial world, with A&R experts and producers and directors and demographers and polists who start pushing them from the outside in, because usually these people break when they're moving from the inside out. And it's funny because you talk about Elvis going to the Army and then Jerry Lee Lewis and other rockabilly artists, as we retroactively call them. I don't think they were called rockabilly at the time. They all thought they were going to hell, especially Jerry Lee Lewis. These were men largely who'd grown up in evangelical churches like Elvis. Elvis didn't believe he was going to hell. Elvis was a devout religious guy who categorized what he was doing as entertainment. He didn't see anything wrong, probably because he also picked it up from black churches and he saw that ecstatic performance. And so he also had the blessing of his mother and father in what he was doing, which was very important, and no preacher telling him he was going to go to hell playing that music. But the other guys, they feared hellfire for playing this rock and roll.
I want to mention also, of course, since we talked about Elvis and we were talking about some of these other artists, the movement of the spiritual into the secular, and how many of these people heard what you said were gospel recordings or came from a gospel background and then took it into the secular side of the tracks as well. And so instead of it being God, I love you, it was baby, I love you. That was a big transition and probably very unacceptable to certain people at the time.
Yeah, and it's been going on for about 400 years. Tommy Dorsey, the African-American Tommy Dorsey, who I think was a great
Famous
gospel
writer,
and
famous gospel writer.
yeah, rhythm and blues guy, turned his back on that. You know, cast out the devils, stop sinning.
Go ahead. I was going to say Little Richard also.
Little Richard, didn't he become a preacher?
Yes, he did.
At a certain point. So
yes.
It would be unfair to say, oh, this only happens to African Americans, because the power of these evangelical Protestant sects in the Deep South among poor whites is equally intense. And when I refer back to, I'm absolutely sure that Jerry Lee Lewis is on record saying, you know, he thought he was going to go to hell for playing this music. This is part of the creative tension. And I trace it back, I hope I'm not rewriting history, to my initial childish grasp that something's going on here. This hokey pokey, something's going on. We had to wait till the 60s, to that turbulent so-called sexual revolution, for any of this to be acceptable among civilized people. And the blues is, and always has been, a way for the unconscious to explode and assert itself.
Now let's talk about another band who really are blues missionaries, or certainly had a mission. There's no doubt about it. The Rolling Stones, and a great track called Little Red Rooster that they did. The Stones, once again, as blues missionaries, as a number of other bands like the Yardbirds and other people were as well. When they came to America finally to play, and they sought out their heroes at chess like Muddy Waters, the tragically early loss of Brian Jones, in his own way a real blues lover himself, and Little Red Rooster and his teardrop guitar that he's playing on there. It might even be a 12-string, as I recall, that he's even playing electric. Regent Studios, where the Stones did their first album, is of course a music store now on the famous Denmark Street in London. And I certainly got exposed to the blues by that British invasion. But the Rolling Stones, John.
Yeah. When I heard Little Red Rooster, I think I must have been 12 or 13, and I heard it on their first record. And I also saw them on Ed Sullivan. I remember seeing Brian Jones, this blonde-haired young kid, playing slide guitar. And again, in retrospect, I realized he was an outsider, he was a Celt, he was a Welshman. And that may have something to do with his ability to pick up on this very, very different music as an outsider. That's a whole other discussion of what they did with the blues. But the blues, I think, with the exception of maybe his Satanic Majesty's Request, which was much more psychedelic and music hall like the Beatles.
Sgt. Pepper driven.
Yeah, Sgt. Pepper driven. But then they have fabulous songs like It's So Very Lonely When You're 2,000 Light Years From Home. As psychedelic as it is, man, that's pure blues. So the Stones are blues driven, and it looks like there's something in North America where indigenous North Americans, that is people who were born here, sometimes have to rediscover their roots through a foreign invasion.
This blues missionary movement of somebody outside of North America bringing it back, and we'll discuss a little bit about Alan Lomax. I was wondering what your take was on that whole thing about Lomax. Why is he so known in Europe by all these people? Yet when I go down to a major center, I'm almost doing like a brief 5-minute mini class on who Alan Lomax was.
Right. Well, I guess the answer to that is at a number of levels. I mean, first of all, it triggers an insight that I had over the last few years that for me, as an anthropologist and ethnomusicologist and performer, Alan was behind a lot of interests that I didn't even know he was there. So only when I became an undergraduate and I heard his Columbia music collection of world music, I'm not describing it properly, and I discovered his discovery of people like Muddy Waters, I said, wow, there's a man behind the discovery of all these people. It's like an explorer. So for me, Lomax is important for discovering and bringing to me the music that I so fell in love with and continue to be influenced by. And then, of course, when I was an undergraduate and I was going deep or wide, I was going wide, you were going deep. And then, as you point out, having worked closely with Anna Lomax Wood on these issues, Lomax permeates my world, clearly to a degree that's, not typical of people. And to really do a great aside, that this Lomax exploration has been going on for 3 generations. I was sitting working on a proposal with Anna, and I said, Anna, here's a politically incorrect question I've had for years. Why all of a sudden in the 60s did African American people stop playing and listening to the blues and white middle class kids start playing the blues? And she said, air conditioning, Geoffrey. And I said, what? She said, well, in the South, people used to play and sit and socialize on their balconies. And the minute air conditioning came in the 60s, it killed the blues.
I want to just add something in conclusion here of our first episode of I Got My Mojo Working to your porch block party type of situation. That last night, I was at my girlfriend's apartment, and all of a sudden, I started to hear music playing outside, and it was blues. It was really loud party, blues. And I kept thinking, is it a recording? Is it a live band? And eventually, my girlfriend came home and was getting late, and she thought, I can't have, she loves blues music. And she said, but we have to go over there and tell them to cool it a little bit. And we went over and ended up getting invited to join this party. And the gentleman who was giving the party was a fellow from Poland.
Right.
And he loved blues, and he had a live band. And there were the guys playing, 2 guitars, drum and bass, fellow playing his guitar through a Dan Electro amp. You remember one of our colleagues had a Dan Electro double neck guitar, of course.
Right.
So interestingly enough, there is still this was this funny little area of somebody actually having, they weren't on their porch, but they were in their backyard.
Right.
And of course they had wisely invited all their neighbors.
Right.
Except my girlfriend, of course, which we ended up getting invited to because the music carried so far, she wasn't exactly right beside them. It wasn't a personal thing. It was just how many people do you think of and how far does music travel throughout the world? And there was the blues outside.
Well, I wouldn't
no
have,
air conditioning.
Yeah, no air conditioning. I wouldn't have brought up Poland in a month of Sundays in this discussion, but I have a close Polish friend who left Poland. He's a little older than me. He's a baby boomer in the late 60s. And I was going through YouTube, and I found the clip where the Rolling Stones came to Poland during the height of the communist dictatorship there. And I sent it to him, and I said, this was your taste of the West. And he said, Geoffrey, I was at that concert. Something flipped after World War II, and blues became dominant, which is a curious phenomena. But I guess, again, if Alan or Anna was sitting in on this, she would smile and say, well, Geoffrey, it was the explosion of individualism, is the notions of collectivism and socialism and communism and Nazism and fascism were dead. They had been defeated by this Anglo-American and, strangely enough, Soviet onslaught against the Nazis. But in the West, it seems to be that the music of the Deep South, that plaintive, individualistic lament, seemed to speak to the post-World War, at least English-speaking and European world, a kind of liberating American individualism that captured your and my soul at a very, very early age.
I think that ends our first episode. Thanks, Geoffrey. Great conversation.
Thank you, Ken. It's always a pleasure.